I'm Roberta Glass, and welcome to my True Crime Report. Today, we're going to be talking about Kathleen Zellner and her $100,000 offer for the real killer of Teresa Halbach with Meredith Elizabeth, who has done many episodes with me about this topic. Welcome, Meredith.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to talk about Steven Avery and his representation.
Yeah, you really know everything about this case. Can you talk about how you got interested in this case and how your opinion changed?
Well, yeah, I wasn't a true crime fan. Making a Murderer was the first, real documentary I had watched, and I was horrified at the end and could not believe such a miscarriage of justice had happened. And I found out when I started reading that they had left a lot out of it. And, when you watch Making a Murderer, it's possible he did it, but, the police looked a little corrupt. But the more you read into it, he's probably the most guilty man I've ever seen. There's really no way he couldn't have done it with all the evidence against him.
Yeah, it's really remarkable how much evidence there is against him. It's not really a close case, in my opinion, at all.
No, it's, most of the cases you can, like the West Memphis 3, I can come up with a 1 or 2% chance on how they didn't do it since there's not really physical evidence linking them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a small possibility, it's tiny, that they didn't do it. And most of the cases, there's a small possibility or plausible reason you can come up with how they didn't do it. In the Avery case, there's so much evidence that he did it that for him have not to do it, someone else would have had to commit the crime. And not only that, but then plant a tremendous amount of evidence with his skin cells, with his DNA, with his saliva, with her DNA on his stuff. It's just implausible that there's no realistic option that he didn't do it. That sort of makes sense. And that's why Zellner's motions get real wacky and very entertaining.
Yeah, we're going to talk about those motions in a second. So who is Kathleen Zellner and how did she get involved in the Avery case?
Kathleen Zellner is an unbelievably bright woman, and she's a great attorney, and she's great at what she does. The story goes that she represented someone who was a serial killer. He had either 20 or 30 bodies that he knew the location of, and she was his attorney in the final stages of his, I want to say the death appeals or whatever it was. But she was able to get him to tell her where 20 of the bodies were. But because of the confidentiality between a lawyer and a client, she could never, while he was alive, say where the bodies were. The second he dies, she has a news conference. She lists off the names of the victims and where they're located. And she said to herself after that, I never want to be in that position again. I never want to represent a guilty person, or so the legend goes, or guilty person again. So then she starts focusing on only wrongful convictions, it seems. And she got Ryan Ferguson out, but the majority of her wrongful conviction cases are ones where the people were convicted based on eyewitness testimony, which now we know can be a little faulty. So they would go back, test the DNA, and the DNA evidence implicated someone else, which is a fairly easy exoneration case. Simply do the testing at the scene that they weren't able to do at the time. And Steven Avery's girlfriend, Sandra Greenberg, wrote into Kathleen Zellner a number of times before the documentary came out saying, can you please take Steven's case? She wanted no part of it. Making a Murderer comes out 2016. The whole nation is turned on its head over Making a Murderer. And because of the publicity, Kathleen Zellner is then his attorney. And Kathleen Zellner and the Innocence Project had said no to taking back on his case, re-signed on for the case after that. But it didn't stay that way.
What do you mean it didn't stay that way?
So Zellner signs on, and Tricia Burnell, who's, I guess, one of the main attorneys in the Midwest Innocence Project, start doing testing. And a tremendous amount of evidence there to test, and they test everything. The test results start coming back, and randomly in the middle of the summer, about 5 months in after Kathleen Zellner had taken it, the Innocence Project quietly walks away. And the story that Tricia Burnell gave was that they wanted a local attorney closer to the courthouse to be involved. And that's why the Innocence Project, quote unquote, walked away, which tells everyone with any sort of sense that obviously when they started doing the testing, all the tests came back that he had done it and they were just trying to get out of it. And then Zellner's now just stuck because while she makes the declaration that, oh, well, if he's guilty, we're going to prove that he's guilty. But in reality, she'll lose her law license if she does that. She has to represent. She has no loyalty to anyone but him. She has to defend him whether he's guilty or not. So let's pretend that she finds out he's guilty. She can't walk away from the case. She'll lose her law license. You can't sign on to a client and then walk away because you find out they're guilty. So her only job is to represent him, give him the best defense possible and the best appeal possible. So she's been stuck. And what she's been attempting to do, it seems, is just throw a whole bunch of stuff at the court where the supporters are confused because her first motion was 1,500 pages with exhibits. And make it seem as if scientists had said things that they hadn't said. Uh-huh. One good example is that, remember how the blood vial theory?
Yes. Can you talk about the blood vial?
Oh, yeah. The blood vial theory was the greatest defense he had. And that was the one that everyone signed on to. And it is as follows. Steven Avery's blood is in 6 spots in the car. How would they possibly have gotten the blood there? The state just happened to have a vial of his blood. And there was a hole in the top. And it was, as in the documentary says, a red letter day for the defense. But turns out a nurse who had put the blood in there, put the hole in, and then because remember they found it and there was Scotch tape on the box. So it looked like somebody had snuck in there. Mm-hmm. It turns out his own lawyers, when he was being exonerated, had gone into that vial. But we still didn't really know if there was EDTA in the blood in the car. There was always a little mystery where, well, we know how the blood got in there, but because it wasn't sealed as evidence, is it possible that the cops went in and took out blood and then planted it? So that's what was left over from the documentary, that we didn't really know whether or not the blood had EDTA in it. And EDTA is a preservative. And if it had been in the vial, the EDTA would have been in the blood in the car. So, and at the original trial, Mark LeBeau from the FBI tested it. But the problem with the test was it wasn't commonly used. It had only been used once before in the O.J. Simpson trial. Mm-hmm. So nobody really knew the validity of the test. So the best defense he had was, did the blood come from the vial? And unfortunately, Kathleen Zellner proved that it did not come from the blood vial, that it came from active bleeding at the time of the murder. When you're online, you'll see some trolls who will run around and scream about the blood vial still. But in reality, Kathleen Zellner took his best argument away. So she came up with a plausible, what she believes is plausible theory on how the blood got to the car. Have you heard this one?
Go ahead.
It's the most absurd theory you've ever read in a legal motion. Her possible suspect and reasoning for how the blood got in the car was that he had cut himself shaving the week of the murder. He had cut his finger. And when he was at home, the finger wound had opened. He had bled all over his sink. His brother was picking him up for Menards, which is, I believe, a wood store. And he ran out. He didn't clean up the blood in the sink. And scientists say they would have had to collect it within 20 minutes. So within 20 minutes, there was somebody who, like a ninja, outside the back door with pipettes. And they ran into the house, collected the blood within 20 minutes in the pipette, and then planted it in the car. That's the most plausible theory that some of the world's best minds came up with.
Wow, that is shocking. Really shocking. It's so poor. So poor a theory.
What other, you have his blood in the car. How do you explain that? And what's the problem is he said a lot of things during the week when he was arrested before they knew about the blood vial. And the cops were saying to him, like, Steven, how would your blood have gotten in the car? He's like, well, I cut my finger this week and I think I left blood on the sink. So his biggest problem is all of his lawyers are committed to what he said. Like, he claimed the cops planted it. And Dean Strang says, well, when your client says the police planted the evidence, you sort of have to go with it. So he gets these great lawyers who have to go off of these ridiculous theories that he just puts out there. And you'll see in Making a Murderer 2, she collects the sink that he bled in. And that's the best theory, that he had ripped open the cut, it was all over the sink, and somebody came in with pipettes and collected it and somehow knew that he would bleed in the sink.
Yeah,
within 20 minutes.
She's the real star of Making a Murderer 2. And in Making a Murder, too, one of the more interesting things that she does, she has Steven Avery's brain fingerprinted in a brain fingerprinting test. Can you talk
brain
about
mapping.
that? Brain mapping.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's never been used in court before, and it's very controversial, and the reason is why.
Mm-hmm.
How it works is sort of like a lie detector test, but they somehow measure the electrodes in your brain.
Mm-hmm.
So if I've seen an image that I've recognized before, I would have one brain response to it. If it was an unfamiliar image or something that I've never heard, I would have another brain response to it. So they sit Steven Avery down and they go over the details of the crime. And according to this brain fingerprint mapping, he did not recognize the crime. This is only one scientist that does this. No other scientist thinks this is valid. And the other problem is what the state believed happened is probably not what exactly happened, how he killed her.
Mm.
Whether it was in the, they think it was in the garage, but it's based on what the evidence is. And then most of it is guessing. So they're reading the prosecution's narrative, and he probably did it slightly different than, let's pretend brain mapping is true. He did it differently than the prosecution would have guessed with little details, so he wouldn't have recognized it.
Interesting. And it reminds me of something I was talking about.
But again, this isn't real evidence. But go on.
Exactly my point. It reminds me of something I was talking about with Alexa when we were talking about the Jamie Snow case, which is these kind of tests. Supporters want it both ways. If there's an eyewitness that supports the convicted person's innocence, then the eyewitnesses are incredible. If it's not, then they're terrible. Especially true with lie detector tests. We were talking about lie detectors. So now brain mapping is the most incredible evidence of his innocence. Unfortunately, it's not admissible in court.
The brain mapping came later in her appeals.
Mm-hmm.
Because what she did first was test the evidence. And the evidence came back exactly the same results as they were in 2005. So now she's stuck. She has nothing. So this is where you get the brain finger mapping coming in. And it's sort of a distraction. In reality, what happens is after a person is convicted, they no longer have the presumption of innocence. It's a much higher bar. To get out, you essentially need to prove with DNA evidence somebody else committed the crime. If you do not have that, you're not getting out. That's like saying somebody's been convicted of a crime, but they passed a lie detector test. Well, sociopaths can pass.
Right.
But that's what her argument is. And lie detectors are much more acceptable and much more well known than brain fingerprinting, which only one scientist buys into.
Does Kathleen Zellner have a theory about who's the real killer?
There's several. She has posted on Twitter many times, the real killer is so-and-so. She believed for a while it was Teresa's ex-boyfriend, Ryan Hillgrist, but the problem is he has no motive, nor was he available that day. But that didn't matter. That spread like wildfire on Twitter that he did it, even though there's no motive or no possible way he could have done it. But then they get back into the Bobby Dassey and Scott Taddick. That's Brendan's brother and his stepfather, who really, their alibis are fine, but they have absolutely no motive. And they're not sociopaths with a history of hurting and beating women. Never mind that, though. So it was based on computer searches. Have you heard about this?
No.
Okay. Kathleen Zellner is trying to argue that, remember in the first trial, they were only allowed to introduce a third possible suspect if they were able to prove a motive?
Okay.
That's called the Denny rule. So you can't just bring in 2,000 people into court and say all these people could have done it. You can bring someone in if you say, well, they were arguing the night before, their relationship had failed, he threatened her, so then you can introduce it if they have motive. They couldn't find anyone with motive besides Steven Avery. What Kathleen Zellner was trying to claim was on Bobby Dassey's computer, which wasn't Bobby Dassey's computer, it was a family computer, that some 6 searches were made about child porn and teenage girls. The question is, though, the Dassey boys were teenagers at the time, so when you're 16 looking up an image of a 16-year-old, it's not really child porn then. The problem was with Steven Avery, once he gets locked up, the child porn searches stopped. Other alarming searches continued, but for whatever reason, the child porn searches stopped as soon as he was locked up. So
Very
it looks
interesting.
to be as if he was the one making a lot of the alarming searches. And what Kathleen Zellner tried to claim was because someone was making disturbing searches, that gives them motive to want to kill Teresa Halbach. And the connector to it was some of the girls of the thousands they searched sort of looked like her. The court obviously threw that out because then the argument was if looking at images of young girls gives you motive for murder, then everybody who looked at those images, which is probably a few thousand people, could be dragged in with motive. So that
Wow.
was thrown out too. She could, and she's a great lawyer. She cannot find anything. The most recent one is the bones.
Mm-hmm.
There was a pelvic bone and another bone found in the quarry right off the property edge, the rock quarry. Brendan, as he explains it, says, we tried to burn down most of the bones, but the larger ones wouldn't burn down. So we threw them on the other side of the property, which makes sense. The FBI in 2005 wasn't able to pull off any cells or DNA off of the pelvic bone and the other bone. So what ended up happening was in 2011, they just gave it back to the family. This is 7 years after the trial. With the other bone saying, we're not 100% sure these are hers. There's no DNA on them, but we figured that you may want to bury them along with hers just in case they were hers. Zellner's arguing that the state destroyed evidence and there could have been DNA on there.
Oh my.
From just the pelvic bone.
That's really terrible to do to the family. I mean, don't they have a right to her bones 7 years after the trial?
I would say so, but many supporters don't think so. Many supporters feel that any remains should be kept in a locker for 25 years in case Steven Avery, her killer, wants to randomly test them.
Wow.
They have still samples from the bones, some small samples, but there was no DNA and no cells on this. It was not even like we don't have the technology to get the DNA off the time. There was nothing there. The bones were burned. They weren't able to pull off anything off the pelvic.
And that was the idea when he was burning her body, is to get rid of the evidence. That was the idea, right?
Well, I would say so. I mean, you can look at it in one of two ways. Why would someone burn a body down into small, tiny pieces? Is it because they want to plant a body on the person's property that may not have been found by burning it so small? Or is it you want to get rid of a body?
Mm-hmm. So
common sense tells me that I would burn a body to that small pieces if I was trying to get rid of it. If I was going to plant it, why bother burning it for 12 hours at all? Why not just stick it under a tree in the property?
Yeah, true.
Supporters think that if it was being planted, it had to be burnt.
That's wild.
No one knows why.
That's a wild, wild way of thinking. And then Kathleen Zellner said she had this big announcement. And then on September 9th, on Twitter, she announced that a concerned citizen had put up $100,000 reward for the arrest and conviction of the real killer of Teresa Halbach. Now, of course, I answered that immediately, and I said, I have it. It's Steven Avery. Where do I collect? Fortunately, she hasn't, and I'm happy to split that with you, Meredith. I feel like you deserve at least half for all the episodes you've done with me. So, first off, is that just ultimate desperation, or?
Yes. And by the way, there's been a reward out forever. It was $25,000, $50,000 for any information towards the real, quote unquote, real killer. And what's more interesting is they really get no responses from it.
That's amazing, because we saw that in the West Memphis 3, where they put up a big billboard and people came up with news stories, decade and a half after the crime of, all sorts of, weirdo stories and new memories. No one has come forward.
And these are not rich communities. These are not people that have millions of dollars and say, you know what, I don't need the $50,000. The communities they're asking information from are living in poverty. So you're telling me that in West Memphis and in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, that if anyone knew anything, they wouldn't have come forward for the $50,000? Well, you remember her 100-question online stunt like 2 years ago?
That was my next question, yes.
Oh, yeah, I tried to enter that. She had written 100 questions about the Avery trial, all of which I could answer. So I emailed and said, I can answer these questions. How do you want me to deliver the responses? Can I just send them over email, or do you want them mailed? And the response was, well, in order to answer the question, you need a doctorate in forensic science. You also need to have experience in investigation and also lab experience as a forensic analyst. So you would need to have 3 jobs, which no one can have at the same time in order to answer the 100 questions.
Wow.
So it was a scam.
Wow. Shocking that
and you had to have
would be a scam.
qualifications like over a decade in, I want to say, lab work. But there's no way you could be in the field investigating as a police officer and also in a lab for 10 years. So the whole thing was a scam.
Wow.
And I think what happened was she put out the 100 questions and about 1,000 people were like, oh, I can answer it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what her point was to try to raise doubt about his guilt, but I think it backfired.
Speaking of backfiring, do you think Making a Murderer 2 helped Steven Avery?
No.
I don't think so either. I mean, I hear from a lot of people who want to talk true crime. And the one thing we all agree on is that Steven Avery is incredibly guilty. Even people who were taken in the beginning by Making a Murderer have now come around to believing that he's completely guilty. I mean, I think there's just almost like the core bit of supporters who it's really like a religion for them. It's no amount of evidence would convince them of Steven Avery's guilt. Do you agree?
They actually don't know. And I've interacted with these people on a fairly regular basis.
You certainly
They
have.
don't actually know the case, and they don't know about any of Zellner's testing. So they're still making the arguments from the Making a Murderer 1. So they don't actually care about the case. They just want to go online and yell at people, and they just need a cause. But they don't really know what's going on with the updated case. And it's a very small population. It's not like the West Memphis 3 had supporters because there wasn't physical and DNA evidence and circumstantial evidence. You know, they only had the circumstantial evidence and a couple of confessions. But in Steven Avery, there's just no question. Mm-hmm. And the supporters just don't really, there's not many. And you look at their rallies and there's like 29 people there. And some flew in from like Europe.
And so will there be a Making a Murderer 3?
I hope not. Making a Murderer 2 was garbage. And I'll tell you why. The first Making a Murderer, you're learning all about the Avery family and how fantastic they were. Very entertaining. It's a great reality show. The second one was all about Kathleen Zellner. And as somebody who thinks he's a guilter, I watched the whole thing. She sort of just doesn't really dispute any of the evidence. So, like, one of the things she does in it is talk about the blood spatter on the back of the door of Teresa's truck, and that it was explained by a blood spatter expert that she must have been hit in the head while she was standing at the back of her trunk. Uh-huh. The problem with that is they don't say, why couldn't Avery have hit her in that back of the head at the end of the trunk? So what Making a Murderer 2 did for me was just tell me more how he did it, what scientists found exactly how he did it. Because disproving what exactly happened and how it happened differently didn't disprove that Avery didn't do it. And that was the problem. Yeah, it was just scientists proved he did it slightly differently than we thought.
Right, and that was one of your biggest points in all our interviews that we've done together, is that Ken Kratz just presented a theory of what happened. Right. He can't know for certain based on the evidence. He puts together the best theory he can based on the evidence that he has.
So we know that she was shot in the head in the garage. We know that because Steven Avery had destroyed the bedding and moved the bed, that at some point she was in his house. We knew that her bones fragments ended up in the fire. So at one point she was burned. So we have little snapshots of what happened, but filling in from snapshot to snapshot, they did their best guessing on. Wow. And like how he originally subdued her, no one knows. You know, they believe she walked into the house, but what if she walked back to the car and he hit her in the back of the head while she was walking around the back of her car? So it's that type of stuff that nobody exactly knows. They think that she was with Steven for an hour before Brendan got there, and she was alive when Brendan got there. What happened during that hour is what people really don't know. After that is when they start doing a lot of physical damage to her. So there's blood in places. There's holes in her skull. There's pieces of her. But that first hour before Brendan gets there is a real mystery. It's all very interesting, though. But out of it, you can tell that for somebody else to have done it, they not only had to kill her, they don't have motive, and then to then mutilate her by burning her, and then planting not only her bones, but Steven Avery's own blood, her blood in the car, her key in Steven Avery's house. They had to make him burn his own bedding, rearrange his room, steam clean the carpet the next day. They had to have him lie to the police several times about having a fire, because he lied about having a fire before there was a reason to have one. And what would have had to happen is so unbelievable that no one else could have done it. And Zellner isn't even looking at law enforcement anymore for it.
That's really incredible that, the beginning of this was all really harassing the detectives, the police officers who were involved in this case. And
Lincoln Colburn, sure.
and Ken Kratz. I mean, do you feel that they've been exonerated in some way? No?
No, I don't think they'll ever have their lives back. I think that there is a small core of supporters that harass them as much as possible. The damage that has been done to innocent people because Zellner has no other arguments is horrific.
I know from the people that I've interviewed in this, the stuff that I've been told off air, that it's really shocking and disturbing. And, so much of it is a money grab, but the consequences for people who are just doing their job and doing their job well, and I believe on the right side of things, it's disturbing and alarming and discouraging. Those would be the adjectives that come up.
Is suing Netflix.
What's going on with that
director.
lawsuit? Do you know? I haven't heard anything. Have you?
It's a civil suit he filed, because apparently you can just sort of document and edit to make people look guilty. But what they did, they took the answers he had in court and moved them around completely. So some of his sentences, they edited the words in different order, and some of them, they put the answers to different questions. So that's the basis of his lawsuit, that they didn't just document and videotape me in court. They moved answers, they cut film, and to make me look suspicious and that I was doing evil. So I think he's going to win that suit.
I hope so, and I hope it discourages other people from making another kind of dishonest documentary about a court case.
And what I often think of, we do know there are some innocent people in prison. They've been exonerated from DNA. Why don't they make any of these documentaries about those people? Why do they seem to only make them about very guilty people?
I know, it's really unbelievable.
Is it because the story is better, or is it because the mystery is there, whether they did it or not? Because there have been people that were falsely accused, but just no documentary seems to show that.
Yeah. I was just talking about this, and there were some cases where, like All Story Simon, who sat in prison, who got put in prison. They got out the guilty guy, Anthony Porter. They put in All Story Simon. They got
is that from the
Murder in the Park documentary?
Yes.
And when All Story Simon was in prison, no Innocent Project offered to help him. No wrongful conviction organization was interested in helping him when it was so clear a case of wrongful conviction, because of course it was their organizations that put him in there to get Anthony Porter off death row. So that's, I highly recommend.
Did they ever clear him? Is he still in prison?
He is out of prison, yes. But Anthony Porter, who is extremely guilty, is walking around. It's amazing. It's an amazing story. I really encourage
Dressed
people
like a
to
pimp,
look
if
into
memory serves.
Yes, yeah. I know you have to run, and I know you had limited time, and I thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about Zellner and Avery. Have you seen recent pictures of him?
Yeah, he looks really old, doesn't he?
There's pictures of him from 2016 when Making a Murderer came out, and then the recent ones, and it's only been like 3 years, are horrific. He's aged like 10 years.
Yeah.
Good. That's what he gets. That's what I say about that. All right.
All right. Thanks so much, Meredith.